She did not beg.
That was the thing no one ever talked about afterward. Not the elders who turned their faces away, not the warriors who gripped their spears with white-knuckled guilt, and certainly not him. They all expected her to beg. She was, after all, an Omega, and Omegas begged. It was practically written into the unspoken law of the pack, stitched between the lines of every hierarchy they had ever built on her people's backs. But Gwen did not beg. She stood in the snow, barefoot, because they had not even given her shoes, in nothing but the thin sleeping shift she had been dragged from her bed to wear, and she looked at Marcus, Wolf King of the Iron Maw pack, the most feared alpha in the known territories, the man who had once pressed his lips to her temple and called her mine, and she said nothing. Not a word. He was magnificent as always, tall as a war monument, broad as the oak gates of Iron Maw Keep, dressed in furs that cost more than Gwen had eaten in the last 3 months combined. His dark eyes were flat, not cruel in that animated, theatrical way some men performed cruelty.
No.
His cruelty was the quiet kind, administrative, like he was signing a ledger entry. Omega Gwen, the elder Harwick intoned beside him, scroll in hand, voice formal as a funeral rite. You are hereby exiled from the territories of the Iron Maw pack, by order of Alpha King Marcus, for the crime of... She knows what she did, Marcus said. He did not look at her when he said it. What she had done, for the record, was survive something she was not supposed to survive. She had outlasted the winter illness that swept through the lower dens. She had, in the process of surviving it, accidentally manifested a pulse of untrained Omega power that cracked the ice on the northern fountain and knocked 4 sentinels off their feet. No one had been hurt, not seriously, but a weak Omega was useful. A weak Omega was manageable. A weak Omega did not crack ice or knock down sentinels. A weak Omega was the role she had been assigned, and she had had the profound inconvenience of no longer fitting it. And Marcus, Wolf King, feared conqueror, stone-eyed ruler of 10,000 wolves, was, at his very core, a man who hated things that did not fit.
So,
exile, in the snow, without shoes. The elder kept reading from the scroll. The wind screamed through the tree line. Gwen's feet were already going numb. She counted her toes, all 10 still there, though she had perhaps 40 minutes before frostbite made that a less optimistic count. She looked at Marcus one last time. He was staring at the middle distance, jaw set, perfectly still, the way he went still when he had already moved past a decision and was simply waiting for the physical world to catch up with his mind. Good luck, Gwen said.
Just that.
2 words. Quiet. Something moved behind his eyes just for a moment. The faintest flicker, like a candle flame in a sealed room. Then it was gone. The guards turned her around. They marched her to the boundary stone, the great carved marker at the edge of Iron Maw territory, and they left her there. No cloak, no food, no fire starter. The boundary stone was 30 leagues from the nearest settlement outside the pack's domain. 30 leagues of the Ashfin forest, which in winter was not a forest so much as a graveyard that had not finished filling up. She watched them go. She let herself count to 60, just to be sure. Then she sat down on the boundary stone, pulled her knees to her chest, pressed her face against them, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of unwitnessed despair. 28, 29, 30. She lifted her head. Right, she said, to no one in particular. Shoes first. She did not know in that moment that the forest was watching her. She did not know that something very old, and very silver and very much not supposed to exist, had been watching her for some time. She did not know that her story, the real one, not the small, sad footnote Marcus had tried to make of her, was not ending here in the snow. It was beginning. Chapter 1. Here is what the histories of the Iron Maw pack would record, in the unlikely event that anyone bothered to write it honestly. Gwen had never been supposed to matter. She was born Omega in a pack that treated Omegas the way some men treat old furniture, useful enough to keep around, never valuable enough to care for. Her mother had been Omega before her, and her mother's mother before that, which in the pack's social mathematics meant the blood had simply run out of anything interesting to do and settled into quiet, self-effacing usefulness. Gwen had been given to the Iron Maw keep service at the age of 9. Not cruelly. She would clarify if you asked, just practically. She was fed. She was housed. She was assigned tasks she performed adequately. She learned quickly and complained never. She had a gift for remaining unnoticed, which among the powerful wolves of Iron Maw keep was approximately the most valuable gift you could develop. She had been 17 when Marcus first saw her. He had not seen her in the way you might hope a man sees a woman, with recognition, with the slow dawning of wonder. He had seen her in the way a wolf king sees an Omega female who is just, without meaning to, stilled every other living creature in a room by walking through it. A pulse of Omega calm so potent it had silenced an argument between 3 senior betas that had been escalating toward violence. "Who is that?" he had said flatly, not as a question. "No one, my king." An Omega. A servant. "Name." "Gwen, my king." He had looked at her the way he looked at interesting things he intended to acquire. That had been the beginning of the end of her peaceful invisibility. The official announcement 3 months later that the king was taking an Omega as a secondary mate had scandalized the entire pack, delighted the gossips, horrified the noble betas who had been positioning their daughters for exactly this kind of opportunity, and confused Gwen enormously. Secondary mate was not a small thing. It was not a comfortable, manageable thing. It was a political lightning rod and a target painted on her back, and she had said so, quite plainly, when Marcus had informed her of his decision. "This seems like a mistake," she had told him. He had looked at her with that flat, assessing gaze and said, "Most people are grateful. I imagine most people haven't thought it through." A very long pause. Then, to her absolute shock, the corner of his mouth had moved.
Just barely.
Almost not at all. Like the ghost of a smile that had died on the way out. "You'll do," he had said. Which was, she understood later, the closest Marcus came to enthusiasm. The next 2 years had been complicated. She had not loved him. She was self-aware enough to recognize that. But she had not hated him either, which made what happened more confusing and not less. He was cold in the way stone is cold, not mean, just unthermal, unreachable, radiating nothing. He was brilliant and ruthless and occasionally, in very small ways, almost considerate. He had once dismissed a senior beta who spoke to her rudely. He had once, on a night she was ill with a fever, sat at the edge of her bed for 2 hours saying absolutely nothing, which she suspected was his version of comfort. It had not been a love story. It had been something stranger, a proximity, a tension, and almost. And then she had survived the winter illness. And the almost had ended. Now she was in the Ashfin forest with no shoes, looking for tree roots that weren't frozen solid enough to use as improvised footwear insulation, and Marcus was in his warm, keeping incomprehensible, and none of it mattered because she was going to die of hypothermia in approximately.
She stopped.
Something was looking at her. She could feel it the way you feel eyes on the back of your neck, that primal, cellular awareness that has nothing to do with reason. She turned slowly. The tree line was dark. The snow between the trees was undisturbed. There was nothing there. And yet, "Hello," she said, which was frankly a ridiculous thing to say to a dark forest, and she was aware of that. But she had always found that acknowledging the absurdity of a situation made it marginally more survivable. Silence.
Wind.
The creak of frozen branches. And then, so brief she almost doubted it, a glint of silver between the trees. Not the silver of ice or reflected moonlight. Something warmer. Something almost luminous. 2 points of it, roughly at eye level if the eye in question belonged to something the size of a very large horse. Then it was gone. Gwen stood very still. "Right," she said quietly. "So, I'm being watched by something enormous and silver in a haunted forest. Without shoes. Wonderful." She found a dead pine at the forest's edge and stripped its inner bark, which was marginally better than nothing for her feet. She found a rock face with a small overhang, which was marginally better than nothing for shelter. She found a colony of snow moss, which, in a season with actual foliage available, she would have ignored entirely, but which could be burned slowly if she could figure out how to make a spark. Before we continue, I'd like you to let me know in the comment section where you are currently watching this story from. Also, do not forget to like and hit the subscribe button for more interesting werewolf romance stories. She had nothing to make a spark with. She sat under her rock overhang with her bark-wrapped feet and her useless snow moss, and she thought, with extraordinary clarity, that Marcus had not even given her a flint. He had exiled her with nothing that could be used to survive. Which meant one of two things. Either he hadn't thought about it, which required believing he was stupider than she knew him to be, or he had thought about it and intended this to be a death sentence. Neither option was particularly warming. She was constructing a small, precise, controlled spiral of fury about this when a shadow fell across the entrance of her overhang. She looked up. There was a wolf in the entrance to her shelter. Not a werewolf. She had seen plenty of those, in and out of shifted form. Not an ordinary wolf either. They were smaller, leaner, and did not have eyes that color. This wolf was silver. Not gray, silver. The way a sword blade is silver. The way moonlight on still water is silver. It was immense. It stood at the entrance of the overhang with the precise, unhurried stillness of something that has never once in its life needed to be afraid of anything, and it regarded her with eyes the color of pale winter starlight.
Gwen looked at it.
It looked at her. "I'm not food," she informed it. "I'm mostly frozen, and my caloric value is questionable at this point." The wolf blinked. "Also," she added, "I have a terrible personality, which I understand affects the taste." The wolf stepped into the overhang. It was so large that it immediately made the space feel much smaller. It turned once, a slow, deliberate circle, and then lay down between her and the entrance to the cave, with the confidence of something that had decided a thing and saw no need to discuss it. Warmth radiated from it like a hearth fire. Gwen stared at the back of its enormous silver head.
"Thank you," she said.
The wolf exhaled, a long, slow breath that misted in the cold air, and appeared to go to sleep. Gwen, for the first time since they had marched her to the boundary stone, let herself think she might survive the night. Chapter 2. She woke to sunlight, warmth, and the extremely unsettling discovery that she was no longer in a rocky overhang but lying on a pile of pine boughs inside what appeared to be a structure of some kind. Rough-hewn walls, a low roof, a fire burning in a stone pit in the center of the space. She sat up very fast, which was a mistake because her head was not ready for vertical and made its objections known loudly. "Slowly," said a voice. She turned. There was a man across the fire from her. The word that came to mind absurdly was silver. Not literally.
He was not metallic.
He was a man of perhaps 30 winters, dark-haired, pale-skinned, with eyes that were an unusual shade of light gray that caught the firelight and threw it back differently than eyes should. He was broad-shouldered but lean, dressed in simple clothing, hunter's wool and leather, and he was sitting cross-legged on the floor watching her with an expression of careful, attentive stillness. "You were the wolf," Gwen said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "The silver one. The one and only." "You're Azariah," she said, and the name left her mouth before she had consciously decided to say it, pulled up from some well of old knowledge she had not known she possessed. The name that the oldest pack members said in hushed voices when they said it at all. The Silver Wolf, the spirit guardian, the one who walked the boundary between the living world and the world that came after. Half myth, half warning, entirely outside the ordered hierarchy of any pack alive. He tilted his head. "You know the name. Old Marin, our pack's bone reader. She used to tell stories," Gwen said. "I thought they were just stories." "Most stories are just stories," he agreed. "Some aren't. She said you were dangerous." Old Marin was a perceptive woman. "She also said you were beautiful, which I thought was an odd thing to put in a warning story." Something shifted in his expression. A small, involuntary amusement quickly reined in. Old Marin was perceptive in several directions. Gwen looked around the structure. It was small but solid, and she noticed now that it was filled with an odd quality of light, not quite natural. The way the air near the boundary stones always felt slightly different from air a few feet away. "Where are we?" "The boundary margin," he said. "The space that exists between your world's edge and what lies past it. It is not easily explained. Try." He looked at her steadily for a moment, as if testing something. "The spirit world has a shore," he said at last, "the way an ocean has a shore. This structure exists on that shore. It is not fully in your world, and not fully in the other. I have lived here for a very long time." "How long?" "Longer than your pack's history. Longer than the Iron Maw name." Gwen absorbed this. She was not, she noted with some interest, afraid. She was cold and hungry and her feet hurt, and she had been exiled by a man she had not loved enough to beg for, and she was sitting across a spirit world fire from a legendary silver wolf god who had apparently chosen to rescue her from freezing to death on a whim, and she was not afraid. She was curious. She had always been cursed with curiosity. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "Because you sat down in the snow and gave yourself exactly 30 seconds to be miserable," he said, "and then you got up and started solving problems. That is either extraordinary courage or extraordinary stubbornness, and I find I have difficulty watching either one die of preventable cold." She blinked. "You were watching before I reached the boundary stone. I told you. I guard the boundaries. Iron Maw's boundary. All boundaries."
She thought about this.
"Then you've been watching the pack for a long time." "Yes." "You've watched Marcus." The stillness that came over him then was different from his usual stillness, heavier, older. "Yes," he said. "And you didn't," she stopped herself. That was not a fair sentence to complete. Azariah was a spirit guardian, not a pack enforcer. The suffering of Omega's underpack law was a human-made problem with a human shape. "You did not blame the river for the drought." "I don't intervene," he said quietly. "In the ordinary way of things. I guard the passage between living and not. I do not govern the living. But you intervened for me. I gave you warmth and a roof. It is a small thing. It is a very large thing, she corrected, when you have no shoes. He looked at her feet. The bark wrapping. We will need to address that, he said. On my list, she agreed. Between find food and figure out what to do with the rest of my life now that I've been exiled from the only home I've known. A full list. I'm a thorough person. He stood. He was very tall. She registered and moved with a quiet animal economy that was not quite human in its exactness. He went to a wooden chest at the side of the room and produced, with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had thought about this in advance, a pair of heavy wool socks and leather boots of roughly her size. He held them out. She stared at them. You prepared for me, she said. I watched you walk to the boundary stone in your sleeping shift, he said, and I noted the elevation and wind chill. Basic preparation. Basic preparation, she repeated. I've been alone for a long time, he said, very evenly. I'm perhaps overly methodical. She took the boots. She put them on. The warmth was extraordinary. She hadn't realized how deep the cold had gotten into her feet until it began to leave.
Thank you, she said.
It felt inadequate. There is food, he said, nodding toward the fire, where a small clay pot sat at the edge of the embers. It's simple. I don't keep a rich pantry.
She ate.
It was simple, a grain porridge with dried herbs and some kind of salted meat she didn't ask about because she was hungry enough that the answer didn't matter. It was warm and it was filling, and it was the most grateful she had ever been for a meal. Azariah sat across the fire and watched her with that careful, patient attention that she was already beginning to recognize as his primary mode of being. He was not uncomfortable in silence. She suspected he was more comfortable in silence than anywhere else. Are you going to ask me what I did? She said. Why I was exiled?
No.
Aren't you curious? I watched the incident with the fountain, he said. I know what you did. You survived something you were meant to be weakened by, and you had the temerity to manifest power in front of a man who requires everyone in his vicinity to be less powerful than him. She set down her bowl. You make it sound simple. It is simple. The politics are complex. The motivation is simple. He's afraid of me, she said. She had not said this aloud before, had barely let herself think it. Yes, Azariah said. Marcus is afraid of me. She tasted it again. He doesn't look afraid of anything. That, said Azariah, with a dryness she had not expected from him, is the most rigorous performance of his life. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire crackled between them. You're not what I expected, she said, from a spirit boundary guardian. What did you expect? Cryptic. Ominous. Lots of portentous riddles. I reserve the riddles for the dying, he said. You are not dying. Simple talk will do. Good, she said. I hate riddles. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. The ghost of a thing. But it was there, briefly, and it changed the whole quality of his face, moved it from merely striking to something that did something complicated to her chest, which she noted and set aside as entirely irrelevant given her current circumstances. Sleep, he said. You need it. Tomorrow we can discuss what comes next. What has come next? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is what I find I am very curious about. Chapter 3. Meanwhile, in Iron Maw Keep, Marcus sat at the head of the great table in the war room and stared at nothing in particular. He did this for 47 minutes, during which time 3 separate advisors entered the room, assessed the expression on his face, and exited again without saying anything. This was the political survival skill of the Iron Maw court, reading the king's face and understanding which of its many varieties of blank stillness meant speak, and which meant leave immediately before I remember you exist. Tonight's face was a leave immediately face. His beta captain, Roderick, a large, practical man with a gray-streaked beard and the instincts of a man who had survived 2 decades of royal service by being systematically more useful than he was threatening, finally came in at the 48th minute and sat down uninvited across the table. Marcus looked at him. "Don't," Marcus said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Roderick said. "You were going to say something. I was going to ask if you wanted wine." "I don't want wine." "Then I'll have some." Roderick poured himself a cup from the carafe on the table, with the magnificent audacity of a man who understood that his value to the king lay precisely in being the one person who could do things like pour wine uninvited without getting thrown out a window. "Cold tonight." "It is winter," Marcus said. "It is cold every night." Roderick drank. Set the cup down. "She didn't beg, you know." The whole court noticed. Old Ferris bet 3 silver pieces she'd beg. He lost. "Tell Ferris I don't care about his betting habits." "Tell him yourself, he won't listen to me." Roderick turned the cup in his hands. "You didn't give her a cloak." Silence. "I also noticed," Roderick continued, in the measured tone of a man walking a rope bridge, "that you didn't give her a fire starter. Or shoes. You gave condemned criminals better provisions than you gave her." "This conversation is ending," Marcus said. "Yes, in a moment." Roderick put down the cup. "Did you mean to kill her, or were you too angry to think?" The question landed in the room like a stone in still water, and the ripples it made were very, very quiet. Marcus's jaw worked. "She is outside the borders," he said. "She is no longer under my protection or my responsibility." "That doesn't answer the question." "It is the only answer I intend to give." Roderick looked at him for a long time. There was something complicated in that look, something that walked the edge between loyalty and grief. He had served Marcus since the king was 16 years old, and making decisions with his fists. He had watched him grow into a man who made decisions with his mind, which was better, mostly. Mostly. "She survived the winter illness," Roderick said. "Every Omega who caught it in the lower den was bedridden for a week. She walked out of it in 3 days and cracked the north fountain. That's not weakness that recovered. That's power that was hiding." "I know what it was." "Then you know she's more useful as an ally then." "She is outside the borders," Marcus said again, very quietly. "She is no longer my concern." Roderick stood. "Right," he said. "I'll leave you to stare at nothing then." He moved to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth, my king, and I know it's worth very little at the moment, the last 3 Omegas who showed spontaneous power manifestation all grew into something considerable. Old Marin was one of them. And what old Marin could do with a pack's worth of spiritual energy was frankly terrifying." He paused. "Just a thought." He left. Marcus sat very still for another 20 minutes. Then he stood, took his cloak, and went to the north wall of the keep, from which on a clear night you could see the edge of the Ashvin forest. He stood there in the cold and looked at the dark line of trees. It was not sentiment. He was not a sentimental man. He was a man who had made a decision in anger that he was beginning to suspect was going to have significant consequences, and he was in the early stages of calculating what those consequences were going to be. That was all. Elsewhere in the lower quarters, the Pax Omega community was performing their own calculations. Gwen had not been beloved. She had been too recently elevated, too closely associated with the king's favor, too politically complicated for easy affection. But she had been theirs, in the way that mattered most. She had been Omega, and she had not been broken by it. She had moved through the keep with a particular quality of quiet dignity that the others recognized and quietly respected. Now she was gone, and the air in the lower quarters was, just slightly, differently charged. A young girl of about 12, whose name was Pell, sat in the corner of the communal room and drew in the margin of a discarded ledger page. She drew a wolf, silver, at the edge of a forest, with a woman standing before it. She did not know why she drew it. She had been dreaming of silver lately. She did not know that she was not the only one. Chapter 4. The second morning in the boundary margin, Gwen woke before dawn and found Azariah already awake, sitting near the door of the structure, watching the strange half-light that passed for sky in this between place. The light here was not quite dawn, and not quite dark. It was the color of water just before a storm, gray-blue and still, with no visible source. "Does the sun not rise here?" she asked. "Not in the way you mean," he said. "Time moves differently in the boundary. Not badly, just differently." She sat beside him. He did not seem surprised by this, or uncomfortable. She was noticing an extraordinary capacity for simply accepting whatever was currently happening without needing to process it at length. She found it deeply restful. She had lived her whole life among people who were constantly performing their reactions for an audience. "Tell me about yourself," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That is a long conversation. I have apparently been exiled with nowhere to be." A pause. "What would you like to know?" "How did you become this?" she asked. "A spirit guardian. Were you born to it?" "No," he said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing something. "I was born to a small pack in the Northern Territories. A very long time ago. Before Iron Maw. Before many of the current packs existed in their present forms." He looked at his hands. "I had a mate. A daughter. We were ordinary. Content in the way that people are content when they do not know what the word means yet, because nothing has taken it from them." He stopped. "You don't have to continue," she said. "I know." He continued. "There was a plague. One of the great pack plagues. They come sometimes. They have always come. We were a small pack, and we had no resources and no protection, and when the plague came, we lost." He was quiet. "We lost everyone. Almost everyone. I survived. I don't know why I survived. I have wondered about it for a very long time." "I'm sorry," Gwen said. "It was a long time ago." "Long time ago or not," she said, "you lost a mate and a child. I'm sorry." He turned to look at her. His eyes in the boundary light were very pale, very clear. Something in them shifted, not painfully, but with the quality of something long sealed being briefly aired. "After," he said, "I walked. I wasn't looking for anything. I was simply unable to stop."
Some wolves are like that.
When they lose what they have, they walk and they do not know how to stop walking. He looked back at the gray-blue sky. "I walked far enough that I reached the place where the boundary thins, where the living world and the other place begin to breathe through each other. And I sat down there because I could not go further and I could not go back." "And something met you there," Gwen said. He glanced at her. "You're quick. You're not exactly a conventional story. Something extraordinary had to happen." "Something met me there," he confirmed. "I don't have a name for what it was. A presence. Old, much older than wolves, older than the boundary itself, perhaps. It did not speak in words. It offered purpose. The boundary needed a guardian. Something to stand at the threshold and keep order at the place where the living and the dead might otherwise blur into each other in ways that cause significant problems for everyone. And you accepted. I had nothing else to do, he said. It was said without self-pity, a plain statement of fact. And there was something clean about it.
Clear.
A task that did not require me to pretend the world was as it had been. How long have you been here? 700 years, give or take. Gwen looked at him. He looked back composedly.
700 years, she said.
Approximately. Alone. The dead pass through, he said. I am not entirely without conversation. Azariah, she said, very carefully, talking to dead people passing through is not company. That's a very specific kind of alone. Something flashed in his eyes, brief and startled, like a fish seen for a moment beneath the surface of a deep lake. He looked away. I had grown accustomed to it. Had, she said quietly. He did not answer. The strange light of the boundary shifted incrementally around them. Somewhere outside the structure, she could hear something like wind, though whether it came from her world or the spirit world, she couldn't have said. What do you know about Omega power? She asked after a while. He exhaled, relief, she suspected, at safer territory. More than most. The packs have largely forgotten the old knowledge. What they call Omega is simply the lowest rank in their hierarchy, a social position. But Omega power is something older than hierarchy. It is, the word your packs use doesn't capture it. Omega frequency, in its truest form, is a resonance frequency. It is the frequency at which living things are in harmony with each other, with the world, with the boundary itself. Gwen stared at him. I cracked a fountain. You were afraid and untrained, and your frequency spiked without direction, he said. A water pipe vibrates at a certain frequency, and it is inert. Vibrate it at precisely the wrong frequency, and it shatters. The principle is the same. You didn't damage the fountain out of power. You destabilized the resonance because you didn't know you were doing it. Servant's parlor trick. Gwen thought about old Marin, sitting in her corner of the keep, dispensing small medicines and quiet advice, and how often the pack's decisions had somehow aligned with what Marin quietly suggested, and how no one ever seemed to notice. She knew, Gwen said. Marin knew what she was. Old Marin, said Azariah, was one of the finest practitioners of Omega resonance I have seen in 4 centuries. She chose to make herself invisible because it was safe, and because she was watching for someone. He paused. She's been watching the Iron Maw Omega bloodline for 40 years. Gwen went very still. Watching for what? Azariah looked at her, with that quiet, patient, silver-eyed directness.
For you, he said. Chapter 5.
The next several days, it was difficult to track days precisely in the boundary margin, where light did not quite follow the sun, fell into a rhythm that Gwen had not expected. Mornings were spent in what Azariah called basic orientation. He taught her, in the spare and patient way of a man who had had centuries to think about pedagogy, how to feel her own frequency. This sounded mystical, and was, in practice, the least mystical exercise she had ever done. It was essentially, as he explained it, the art of noticing what she was already doing. You've been doing this your entire life, he told her on the 3rd day, as she sat cross-legged across from him in the boundary structure with her eyes closed and her face arranged in an expression of intense skeptical concentration. Every time you walked into a room and argument stopped. Every time an injured animal went still in your hands. Every time you understood, before anyone else, that the air in a room was wrong. That always seemed like ordinary perception, she said. Ordinary perception does not stop arguments between three senior betas. They were tired. Gwen. Fine.
She breathed.
Felt in the place behind her sternum where she had always thought everyone felt things, and only recently begun to suspect was unique to her, that low hum. The thing that pulsed when the world was too much. The thing that had cracked the fountain. I feel it.
Good.
Don't try to do anything with it. Just feel it. It's like a bell, she said. A bell that's been rung and is still vibrating. Yes, he said, and something in his voice was different. Charged, interested.
Precisely that.
Now, do you notice that it has a direction? She frowned. It did have a direction. Or rather, it resonated differently depending on which direction she was facing. Its strongest toward the west. That is the direction of Iron Maw Keep. She opened her eyes. He met her gaze steadily. You are bound to your pack's frequency. Even in exile, the attachment doesn't sever simply because they declared it severed. That's extremely inconvenient. It is, yes. Can it be severed? It can be redirected, he said. With training. Time. She closed her eyes again. The Western resonance was warm and familiar and tangled up with everything she had ever known, and underneath all of it, like a splinter she'd stopped noticing, was the specific frequency she associated with Marcus. Cool and controlled, and always just slightly wrong key like an instrument that needed tuning. She had been tuning herself to his wrongness for 2 years. No wonder I was exhausted, she said. Azariah's voice was careful. He is not a simple frequency. A king who leads from control and suppression, that creates a very particular interference in the pack resonance. Everything tuned to him is tuned to compression, to holding still, holding quiet. He didn't do it on purpose, she said.
No.
He doesn't know he does it. A pause. He is not, at his core, what he presents. She opened her eyes again. You've been watching him since he was 8 years old, and his father killed his mother in front of the court for having the wrong frequency. Azariah said, very quietly. The silence was total. She was an Omega, Gwen said. She was an Omega. His father, a pause. His father was a man who feared everything he couldn't control. He feared her particularly. He had her presented as weak and strange and a danger to the pack, and he killed her publicly, and then he shaped his son in his own image, and he died very pleased with himself. Azariah was looking at the fire. Marcus has spent 30 years becoming the thing his father made him, because it is the only thing he knows how to be. And he exiled an Omega woman, Gwen said, very quietly, without shoes. Yes. Because she scared him. Yes. Gwen sat with this for a long moment. She did not feel charitable toward Marcus. She was not in the business of excusing people who did unkind things because of their difficult histories. She had a difficult history herself and had managed to avoid exiling anyone without shoes. But she felt the shape of it, the terrible logic of it. A boy who watched his mother destroyed for her power, who grew into a man who could not tolerate power in anyone near him, who then, by the sheer irony of fate, bonded to an Omega who was quietly, slowly, coming into something he had no category for. He would have had to become a different person to respond to me differently, she said. Yes. And he doesn't know how to do that.
No.
Can he learn? Azariah looked at her. That, he said, is a question I genuinely don't know the answer to. Gwen nodded. She pulled her knees up to her chest and stared at the fire. I'm angry at him, she said. I want to be clear that none of this explanation makes me less angry. You would be a fool not to be angry. Good. Just checking. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to collect these almost smiles the way some people collected stones. Each one was different, each one told you something, and they were rare enough that finding one felt like a small victory. "Teach me more," she said. He taught her. Days passed, or what passed for days. She learned to feel the pack frequencies as distinct signatures, learned to understand why some felt sharp and some felt warm, and some felt like walking into a room where someone had recently been very afraid. She learned that the boundary margin itself had a frequency, deep and slow and entirely unlike anything living, like the bass note beneath all other notes that you feel in your chest rather than hear with your ears. She learned that Azariah's frequency, when she felt for it carefully, was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was old and deep and silver in the way his fur was silver, not reflecting other light, but generating its own. It did not pull at her the way her pack frequency did. It did not demand anything. It simply was. She found herself thinking about it at odd moments. She did not quite think about why. Chapter 6. 11 days after the exile, and Gwen would have been interested to know it had been 11 days, since her time sense in the boundary margin had become entirely unreliable. Roderick rode to the edge of the Ashfin forest. He went alone. He told no one. He was a beta captain of significant authority and could requisition a horse without explaining himself, which he did, and he rode through the frozen pre-dawn, and he tied his horse to a tree at the forest's edge, and he walked in. He was not sure what he was looking for. Confirmation that she was dead, perhaps. So he could put a number to the thing Marcus had done and lay it out plainly where it couldn't be avoided. Or he was aware this was less likely something else. He walked for 2 hours. He found nothing. The forest was cold and quiet and largely indifferent to him. He found a sheltered overhang that might have been used as shelter. There were marks in the frozen ground that suggested occupation, but nothing else. He was about to turn back when the wolf found him. It came out of the trees to his left with no warning, moving soundlessly across the snow, and it was the largest wolf he had ever seen in his 38 years among wolves, in and out of shift. Silver-furred, pale-eyed, it walked directly up to him and stopped 3 feet away and looked at him the way one person looks at another person they have already assessed and made a decision about. Roderick, who had survived 20 years of Iron Maw court politics, stood very still and did not reach for his weapon. "Right," he said quietly. "You're the Silver Wolf." The wolf looked at him. "Rumor says you guard the boundary. Rumor also says you're not entirely what you look like." He kept his voice even. "Is the Omega alive?" The wolf sat down in the snow, very deliberately, as if the answer to that question was so obvious it barely deserved the dignity of a response. "She is," Roderick said. "You have her." The wolf blinked once. "Good," said Roderick. He exhaled a breath he had apparently been holding for 11 days. "Good." He rubbed his face with one hand. "For what it's worth, and I can see by your face that it's worth very little, I oppose the exile. Formally, which is recorded in the court ledger and will be there if it ever matters." He paused. "Marcus is," he stopped. Started again. "Marcus is not going to forget her. He never forgets anything. The question is what shape the not forgetting takes." The wolf was listening with that particular quality of focused stillness that Gwen would have recognized. "I don't know what you're planning," Roderick said, "and I probably don't want to know. But if he stopped again. "She's going to come back," he said. Not a question. A statement that seemed to come from somewhere below reason, from the part of old beta instincts that still remembered what a pack in proper frequency felt like. She's going to come back different, and the pack is going to need to decide what it does with that. He looked at the wolf steadily. "Tell her," he said, "that not everyone at Iron Maw Keep is what Marcus made them." The wolf looked at him for a long moment. Then it turned and disappeared back into the trees, and Roderick stood alone in the aspen forest for a while before he turned and walked back to his horse. He rode back to the keep. He said nothing to Marcus. But that evening, very quietly, he visited the lower quarters and sat with the Omega community and drank their thin tea and listened to Pell tell him about the silver wolf she kept dreaming about, and he thought carefully about what comes after. Chapter 7. The change happened slowly, the way changes that matter always do, without announcement, without the ceremony that would later seem appropriate, 1 degree at a time. He started leaving the structure. In the early days, he had been there when she woke and there when she slept, and very precisely attentive in between, and she had understood this as simply the logistics of a man responsible for her survival. But as she grew more capable, as she learned to navigate the boundary margin's strange half-light, to draw on her own frequency for warmth and for finding food, to exist in the between place with some degree of confidence, he began to move further. Ranging, as if her growing independence was expanding his own radius. She did not mention it. She was learning to appreciate what was offered rather than asking for what was withheld. But she noticed. She also noticed, more slowly, more carefully, with the circumspect attention of someone who has been burned by noticing things before, that he talked more. Not in volume, not in the sense of longer speeches or increased chattiness, but in depth. He began to reach for information when she asked questions rather than deflecting. He answered the question about his mate. Her name had been Petra. She had been a laughing woman, a hunter, better at tracking than he had ever been, and there was something in the way he said it that told Gwen he had not spoken her name aloud in a very long time. He answered questions about the spirit world, what he saw when wolves passed through, whether they were afraid, whether they found what they expected on the other side. He was careful about specifics, but he was honest, and what he shared had the quality of long-kept things finally being aired. She gave him things in return, without planning to. She told him about her childhood in the lower dens, the specific humor of Omega community life, the jokes that only made sense if you had been invisible long enough to see what powerful people looked like from below. She told him about the time she had anonymously rearranged the War Room's documents in a way that resolved an argument the senior betas had been having for 3 months, and no one ever figured out who had done it. He laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was a short, quiet, slightly startled thing, as if laughter had arrived without quite being planned for. But it was absolutely real, and it transformed his face, and Gwen found herself memorizing it with a thoroughness she then had to firmly redirect. The thing was, she liked him. Straightforwardly, uncomplicated, she liked him. She liked his precision and his patience and his occasional dry wit and the way he was never performing for her. Not even slightly. She liked that he took her seriously, not as a project or a subject or a rank, but as a person whose mind he found genuinely interesting. She was also very aware that he was a 700-year-old spirit guardian who had been alone since before her pack existed, that the rules governing normal human and werewolf relationship mathematics almost certainly did not apply to his situation, and that she was possibly projecting warmth onto the first genuinely kind presence she had encountered in years. She was tracking all of this, internally, with some rigor. She was not, however, tracking it so rigorously that she failed to notice, on a particular evening when they were sitting outside the structure watching the boundary sky do its strange gray-blue slow-breathing thing, that he had shifted marginally closer to her than he usually did, and that this had happened over a series of evenings in imperceptible increments, and that this was not, she strongly suspected, unconscious. "Azariah," she said. What happens to the people the boundary guardian forms attachments to? A pause. That is an extremely specific question. I am an extremely specific person. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky, and his profile in the strange light was, she did not try to find words for it. She was done pretending the words didn't suggest themselves. The boundary guardian, he said carefully, has not formed an attachment in 700 years. I know, she said. I'm asking what happens. Another pause. I don't know, he said. It has not happened. What do you imagine? He turned to look at her then, and his eyes in the boundary light were the color of something she had no name for. Not gray, not silver, not the color of anything she could point to in the ordinary world, just the color of him, of Azariah, which she suspected she would be able to close her eyes and see with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. I imagine, he said, very quietly, that it would complicate things considerably. Yes, she said. I imagine it would require the person in question to know that the boundary guardian is not fully of the world, that there are constraints on what is possible. I imagine the person in question already has some sense of that, and does not find it prohibitive. She thought about it. Honestly. No, she said. I find it clarifying. You're not asking me to fit into a hierarchy or a rank or a role. You're just, she gestured, slightly helplessly at him. You. Which is its own category entirely. Something in his face changed. Not the almost smile, something bigger than that, something that opened rather than closed. He looked at her as if she had said something he had not expected, and was now adjusting the shape of everything slightly to accommodate it. Gwen, he said. Yes. I want to tell you something. I'm listening. You will need to go back, he said. Not now. Not soon. But eventually. What you are becoming, it is not a gift for one person in a spirit world margin. It belongs in the world. It belongs in your pack, or whatever you choose to make of what your pack becomes. She was quiet. I know, she said. That, he said, is the honest thing I had to say first, before anything else. I know, she said again. Tell me the other things. And he did. Chapter 8. The thing about Gwen's exile was that the Iron Maw pack was not, in fact, a monolith. 23 days after her departure, the first incident occurred in the lower quarters. A young beta woman named Tessa, who had always had the pack's lowest-ranked role in the kitchen, manifested a spike of omega resonance, so precise and directed that it stopped a fire in the storage rooms before the alarm was even raised. She had no idea how she had done it. She stood in the corridor afterward with soot on her face, and her hands shaking and her eyes very wide, while the storage master stared at her and did not say anything. News of this reached Marcus within the hour. He said nothing. 4 days later, a second incident. A male Omega in the stables, who had never shown any unusual ability in the 15 years he had served there, demonstrated a profound and unexplained ability to calm 2 fighting stallions by simply walking between them and standing still. The horses, who moments before had been causing the kind of chaos that resulted in injured grooms, simply stopped, looked at him, became docile. Marcus heard this report and sat very still at his desk for a considerable time. Something has shifted, he said to Roderick. Yes, Roderick said neutrally. In the Omega Quarter. It would appear so. Marcus set down his pen. When an Omega of significant power is removed from a pack's frequency, he said, very precisely, there is sometimes a resonance cascade. The departure creates space. Other dormant frequencies begin to emerge. Is that so? Roderick said, who knew this already, as did anyone who had read the pre-hierarchy pack histories, which Marcus clearly had, because Marcus had read everything. It is not desirable, Marcus said. Multiple emerging omega frequencies in a pack is widely considered, in the older texts, to be a significant asset, Roderick said. It is unpredictable. Assets generally are. Marcus looked at him. Roderick looked back with the magnificent patience of a man who had made his argument many times in many different ways and was fully prepared to keep making it until the heat death of the universe. The exile, Marcus said, very quietly, may have been. Yes, Roderick said. I didn't finish. I know, but yes. Marcus was quiet. Then, where is she? I don't know, Roderick said, which was technically true, in that he knew she was alive and somewhere in the general territory of the spirit boundary, but not which specific location she occupied at any given moment. She cannot have survived the forest. It has been 3 weeks, no shelter, no supplies. She is alive, Roderick said. Marcus went very still. You know, he said. I went to look. I found. Roderick considered his words. Evidence that she had shelter. I don't know the full particulars. A very long silence. You did not tell me.
No.
Why? Roderick met his gaze levelly. Because I wanted her to have 3 weeks of not being under your authority, my king. I thought she had earned at least that. The silence that followed this statement was the kind that required structural reinforcement. Marcus stood. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time looking at the dark. She will want something in return, he said finally. When she comes back. I imagine so. She will want changes. I would wager on it. The pack may not accept changes of the kind she would require. The pack, said Roderick, is currently watching 2 previously unremarkable omegas demonstrate things they should not be able to do, and the mood in the lower quarters is not what I would describe as resentful. My king. Marcus said nothing. She might, Roderick said carefully, be interested in returning if the invitation were made correctly, with appropriate specificity about what has changed. And if nothing has changed, then I suggest you write a very good letter anyway, Roderick said, and hope she has become more patient than she left.
Chapter 9.
The letter arrived in the spirit boundary margin in a way that Gwen would later be unable to explain precisely. It was as if the boundary itself, which was permeable to things the physical world might have called impossible, simply made room for it. She found it at the entrance to the structure one morning, weighted with a small stone, written in a hand she recognized with a chest tightening that she did not particularly welcome. She picked it up. She took it inside. She set it on the floor by the fire. She sat across from it for approximately 3 minutes before Azariah came in from the perimeter with a brace of winter rabbits and looked from her face to the letter and back to her face. Do you want me to leave? He asked. No, she said. I want you to be here because you make me think more clearly, which I recognize is a slightly uncomfortable thing to tell you, but it is true. He sat down. He set the rabbits aside. He said nothing, which was exactly right. She picked up the letter. It was not long. Marcus was not a man who was verbose. She had always found his terseness either aggravating or, depending on the day, a relief. It said, You are alive. I know you are alive because Roderick went where I should have gone and came back with the confirmation I needed. The exile was executed in anger and without adequate provision, which I will not call a mistake because it was worse than a mistake. It was a choice made in the particular cowardice of a man who fears what he does not understand. I understand more now. Not enough. Possibly never enough. but the pack is changing. Things are emerging in the Omega Quarter that I am told, by several people, with the persistent patience of several people who are deeply tired of me, are connected to your departure and would be better addressed with your return. I am not asking you to return to what was, which I understand is not available, nor would it be fair to ask for it. I am asking you to consider returning to what might become. Whatever conditions you require for that consideration, name them. I am informed I have become, over the past 3 weeks, significantly less insufferable to be around. This is described to me as an improvement. Marcus. Gwen read it twice. She set it down. That is, she said, the most Marcus letter that has ever been written. What does it say? Azariah asked. She handed it to him. He read it. He was quiet. He is afraid, Azariah said, that he sent you to die. And he is not entirely wrong to be afraid of that. He's asking me to come back. Yes. On my terms. Yes. She looked at the fire. What do you think? Azariah was quiet for a moment, in the way that was different from his ordinary quiet, more active, more careful. I think, he said, that what you have been learning here is not meant to live in the boundary margin. I think that every day it sits unused in the ordinary world. There are people in your pack who are needlessly exhausted, needlessly compressed, needlessly. Azariah.
He stopped.
What do you think? She said, more quietly. Not what you think is right. What do you think? He was silent for a long time. I think, he said, that you being in the world and me being in the margin is the shape of the world as it is supposed to be, and I have spent 700 years believing that the shape of the world is sufficient, and I find now that he stopped. I find that I am revising that position. You could come to the boundary of the territory, she said. You guard the boundary. The boundary includes Iron Maw territory. Yes, it does. He looked at her. She looked back. I cannot fully leave the margin, he said. I am bound to it. I know. I'm not asking you to leave it. I'm telling you that the Iron Maw territory boundary is within your domain, and that I will be able to feel your frequency from within it, which I have learned is not nothing.
To me.
He was very still. It is not nothing to me either, he said. She nodded. She looked at the letter. She thought about the pack, the lower quarters, Pell drawing silver wolves in ledger margins, Tessa standing in a smoky corridor with ash on her face and power she had never been told she had. She thought about old Marin, watching and waiting and planting small seeds for 40 years. She thought about Marcus, which was complicated, but she thought about him honestly. Not the man who exiled her. Not the man she had almost loved or not quite loved, but the boy who had watched his mother killed for her frequency, and the man he had built from that wreckage, and the letter he had written in a hand she recognized as his most careful handwriting, which meant he had written and rewritten it. She thought about what she was now, not the Gwen who had been marched to a boundary stone, but this Gwen, the one who had learned to feel her own frequency and found it was a great deal more than she had been told. I'll need to set conditions, she said. Yes. Real ones. Non-negotiable ones. Yes. The Omega hierarchy as it currently exists needs to be dismantled. Not softened. Dismantled. New framework, with actual protections written into pack law. That is correct. Marcus will need a reckoning. Not a performance of one, an actual one. Yes. And old Marin gets to stop pretending to be small. Something in Azariah's expression was very warm. Old Marin will be pleased to hear it. Gwen picked up the letter. She turned it over. She wrote on the back, in the plain handwriting of a woman who had no patience for elaborate penmanship. 3 conditions non-negotiable. 1. Omega hierarchy formally dissolved and replaced with a rights framework written by the Omegas of Iron Maw, not the Betas.
2.
You sit with me in the council room as an equal voice, and that is how it remains.
3.
You tell me, plainly and without diplomatic phrasing, what happened to your mother. I need to know you understand why that matters. If these are met, I will come to the border in 7 days and we will talk. Gwen. She folded it. She held it out. It lifted from her hand, which it should not have been able to do, and drifted toward the door, which it passed through, and was gone. Does that happen often? She asked. In the boundary margin, Azariah said, with great composure, occasionally the world assists.
Chapter 10.
On the 6th day, Marcus came to the Ashvin forest alone. He did not send a letter. He did not send Roderick. He rode to the forest edge, left his horse, and walked into the trees, and he walked until the temperature dropped in the particular way that told old blood wolves they were near something that was not quite ordinary, and he stopped. He stood in a small clearing. He waited. After a while, the silver wolf came out of the trees. Marcus had known enough from the old histories to recognize what he was looking at. He was not a man given to superstitious awe. He was a man given to strategic assessment, and his assessment of the figure before him was significant beyond any calculation I have previously made. He stood very still. The wolf sat across the clearing from him. It did not advance. It did not threaten. It simply regarded him with that pale, ancient, extraordinarily patient gaze. "She's with you," Marcus said. The wolf looked at him. "She's alive and she's with you, and she has been here this whole time." He said it factually, without inflection. "I sent her into your territory." The wolf blinked. Was that? He stopped. He did not, as a rule, speak his fears. He was out of practice. He had made so many decisions from a place of sealed-up fear that verbalizing it felt like removing a load-bearing wall from a building that was still occupied. Was it? He tried again. "I need to know if he stopped again." He stood in the snow in the Ashvin forest, Wolf King of Iron Maw, and he looked at a 700-year-old spirit guardian, and he said, with the stark, stripped precision of a man who has run out of other options, "Is she all right?" The wolf looked at him for a long moment. Then it stood, turned, and looked back over its shoulder. Marcus followed it. It led him through the trees for perhaps 20 minutes, and then it stopped, and Marcus stopped, and across a small, snow-covered clearing, he saw Gwen. She was standing at the edge of the trees on the other side of the clearing, in a heavy cloak, real clothing, not a sleeping shift, with her hair loose and her chin level, and she was different in a way he could feel before he could articulate it. The frequency she was running at was not anything she had been when she was in the keep. It was clear and deep and uncompressed, like a voice that had been speaking in a whisper for years and had finally found its full register. He was, for a moment, simply stopped. She walked across the clearing toward him. "You came early," she said. "I don't like waiting," he said. "I know." She stopped at a distance that was not cold but was not warm, was exactly as deliberate as everything she did. "Did you receive my conditions?" "Yes." And he met her gaze. "They are accepted. All three. All three." She studied him.
"The third one," she said.
"Tell me." He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Her name was Elena," he said. "She was my father's mate and my mother, and she was an Omega who could do things. Things I didn't have names for. She made people feel safe without doing anything visible. She made the pack feel right, in a way it didn't feel without her." He paused. "My father had her killed in the court because the senior betas were beginning to listen to her more than to him. He called it a threat to pack order. His jaw tightened. I was 8. He told me afterward that she was dangerous. That power like that in an Omega was an unnatural thing. And I believed him, and then I spent 30 years building the man he told me to build, and then you came along, and he stopped.
And I scared you, she said.
Yes, he said, because I reminded you of her. Yes. And killing her hadn't worked for your father, she said, so you tried exile instead.
Yes, he said.
He stopped. Started again. I have spent 30 years ensuring I did not have to say this word, and I find that it is all I have left to offer. So. He looked at her directly. I am sorry, Gwen. For the exile.
For the manner of it.
For not giving you a damn cloak. She was quiet. It was, she said finally, genuinely one of the worst things anyone has ever done to me. I know. I'm not going to forgive you today. I'm not asking for today. Good. She pulled her cloak tighter. But I will come back. On my conditions. Yes. The council seat is not ceremonial. I have an actual voice. Yes. And old Marin goes first in the Omega Rights Council. She's been thinking about this for 40 years, and I am not going to waste that. The corner of Marcus's mouth moved. Not much. A fraction. Old Marin has been planning a revolution for 40 years, and you want to give her the platform to execute it. Yes. The senior betas will have significant objections. The senior betas, Gwen said pleasantly, are welcome to discuss those objections with me directly. He looked at her. She was, he thought, the only person he had ever met who could make a pleasant tone sound genuinely alarming. He had spent 2 years underestimating how alarming she was. He suspected that was what he had found most frightening, not her power, but the intelligence behind it. Tomorrow, she said. I'll come to the border at dawn. I'll be there.
She turned.
She walked back across the clearing. At the far tree line, she stopped and turned back.
Marcus, she said.
He looked at her. Your mother would have been extraordinary, she said. I think you know that. He said nothing, but something crossed his face, briefly, rawly, before he put it away, something that might have been grief, or relief, or the small, unbearable dignity of being seen. She turned and walked into the trees. The silver wolf, which had been sitting at the edge of the clearing through this entire conversation with the attitude of someone who has read this book before and knows how it ends, stood, stretched with enormous unhurried leisure, and followed her. Chapter 11. She came to the border at dawn, as she had said she would. Marcus was already there, as he had said he would be. He had brought, she noted with something that might have been amusement and might have been something warmer than that, a good cloak, heavy wool, lined with rabbit fur. He held it out without saying anything. She took it. It was warm.
Good morning, she said.
Good morning, he said. They walked the border road back toward the keep, and it was not comfortable, and it was not resolved, and there were a great many things between them that would take time and truth and considerable patience to untangle. But it was honest, which was more than it had ever been before. In the keep, Roderick was waiting in the entrance hall with an expression of profound and undisguised relief. He gave her a nod that contained, she felt, about 47 things he was not going to say aloud. Old Marin was in the lower quarters. When Gwen came in, the old woman was sitting in her corner in her usual chair with her usual expression of observant composure, and she looked up, and her face did something it rarely did. It showed what she was feeling. You went to the boundary, Marin said. Yes, Gwen said. He found you. He did. Marin looked at her, looked at her with the deep attentive look of someone reading frequencies. Her eyes, which were very old and very sharp, went wide for a moment.
Just a moment. You've been training, she said.
I've had a very good teacher. The Silver Wolf, Marin said. It was not quite a question. Azariah, Gwen said. His name is Azariah. Old Marin sat back in her chair with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been playing a very long game and has just seen the board arrange itself in the configuration she has been waiting for.
Good, she said.
Sit down. We have a great deal of work to do. The Iron Maw pack did not change overnight. That is not how change works, despite what stories sometimes suggest. Change is slow, and it is argued over, and it requires people to become uncomfortable in ways they would strongly prefer not to become uncomfortable, and it frequently takes more time than anyone finds acceptable. But it began. The Omega Rights Framework, drafted in 5 long sessions by Marin, Gwen, Tessa, and 11 other Omegas who had been waiting for precisely this invitation, was presented to the full council in the spring. The senior betas objected, as Marcus had predicted. Gwen responded to those objections, as Marcus had also predicted, in a way that was difficult to argue with because it was meticulously reasonable and because the frequency she ran while making her arguments had a disconcerting tendency to make everyone in the room feel that they very much wanted to reach an agreement. Marcus sat beside her at the council table. He was, it turned out, somewhat more useful than she had expected. Not because he agreed with her automatically, he didn't and she didn't want him to, but because his particular genius for strategy meant that when he understood her objectives, he found paths through political resistance that she hadn't seen. They argued frequently. They argued well. It was the first genuinely equal argument Gwen had ever been in, and she found she loved the specific shape of it. They were not in love. Not yet. Perhaps not in the way the stories meant. But they were building something out of the wreckage of what had been, and it was honest. And honesty was where everything true starts. And at the edge of the Iron Maw territory, at the place where the territory touched the great western forest, an enormous silver wolf was sometimes seen at dawn, sitting at the boundary, facing inward, with a particular quality of stillness that belongs to something very old that is found, after a very long time, a reason to look toward the world rather than away from it. Gwen felt his frequency every morning when she woke. Clear and deep and silver, like a bell that had been rung and was still, after all this time, beautifully, powerfully, and entirely surprisingly still ringing. She would walk to the border, when she could. They would sit together at the edge of things. He would tell her what he saw on the boundary, and she would tell him what was happening in the world, and the space between the living and the spirit world would breathe slowly around them, neither threatening nor demanding anything. Just present. Just possible. Little Pell, who was now 13 and had graduated from drawing silver wolves in ledger margins to drawing them on proper paper, drew one last image in the series she had been making, a woman and a wolf, sitting together at the edge of a forest, watching the sun rise over a pack that was, slowly and with considerable argument, becoming something better than it had been. She called it what the boundary knows. She gave it to Gwen. Gwen hung it on the wall of her council chamber, where the senior betas could see it, which she considered a perfectly adequate bonus.